Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into the ivy-strewn madness of ancient myth, where wine flows like water, women howl at the moon, and one god turns grief into parties, rage into dance, and divine ecstasy into organized chaos. You're not walking into just another story. You're stepping into the damp soil beneath a vineyard at dusk, where the air smells like crushed grapes, burnt offerings, and something ancient you can't name. Your fingers brush against sticky vines, your breath is warm in your throat, and the rhythm in the distance, that's a drumbeat made from stretched goat hide, calling you towards something you probably won't survive, but might enjoy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere wild, say, a cramped Tokyo apartment or a fog-drenched Scottish hill drop, your location and your local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through soft earth, the world around you melting into myth. Here comes Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, theater, and what most moralists call bad decisions. But don't be fooled. He isn't just the patron of drunk uncles and toga parties. He's trauma incarnate, born from death, raised by nymphs, and so emotionally complex that he once made an entire city hallucinate until they cried in public. His birth alone would make your family therapy look tame. Picture this. Zeus, serial philanderer and part-time lightning bolt, has a fling with Semele, a mortal princess. She gets pregnant, classic move, and then is tricked by Zeus's jealous wife Hera into demanding that her godly baby daddy reveal his full divine form. He does. She vaporizes on the spot, like instant cremation via too much truth. Somehow in the aftermath, Zeus reaches into the steaming remains, pulls out the fetus, and sews the thing into his own thigh. Yes, you heard that right. Dionysus becomes the only god born from both a mortal woman and his dad's actual leg. This isn't just drama, it's cosmic-level melodrama. Historians still argue whether this myth is a metaphor for rebirth, patriarchal creation panic, or just proof that Greeks were weirdly obsessed with thighs. Anyway, Dionysus is carried to term inside Zeus's leg meat, then cut out and handed off to a secret foster crew, forest spirits, mountain women, and depending on the version, a few gender-bending caretakers who teach him to blur every line, male, female, sane, mad, wholly taboo. As a kid, he learns not just how to ferment grapes, but how to ferment minds. That wine he'll one day pass to mortals? It's not just alcohol, it's psychological weaponry, a mood-altering device, a social solvent. It lowers walls, loosens tongues, unbuttons togas, and turns rigid systems into dance floors. You sip, and suddenly you're telling your enemy he has kind eyes. You sip again, and now you're doing interpretive dance about your unresolved mother issues. Dionysus isn't a party god because he likes fun, he's a party god because he knows how. Deep your sadness runs, and exactly what beat to drop to break the damn dot, and he doesn't arrive quietly. He wanders through the world like a dreamy cult leader with flowers in his hair and fire in his voice. He shows up in cities and either converts them or curses them. Converts get music, ritual, euphoric community bonding. Rejectors? They get torn apart, sometimes literally. Remember Thebes? His own birthplace? The king there bans his cult, calls it dangerous, feminizing, subversive. Dionysus says cool, cool, and drives every woman in town into a frenzy. They run to the hills, abandon their babies, and start frolicking with wild animals and hallucinating divine ecstasy. One of them rips the king to shreds with her bare hands. Turns out she's his mother. Yeah, it's that kind of myth. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand the vibe Dionysus is cultivating. He's not the god of orgies yet. He's not even the god of wine snobs swirling their glasses and talking about mouthfeel. He's the god of thresholds. You know that moment just before you cry in public? Or that giddy, tipsy second before you kiss someone you shouldn't? That's his realm. His parties weren't frat house bacchanals. They were ritualized, choreographed, emotionally calibrated journeys through the self. Wine was sacred, sex was symbolic, and the drums were a kind of therapy. You didn't just go to Dionysus's rites to let loose. You went to shed your mask, to become something else. Maybe even something better. And speaking of sacred emotional release, here's your first sex story of the night. From the pages of Sex with Kings, let's time travel to Versailles, where King Louis XV kept a rotating cast of teen mistresses in a private pleasure house called the Parc aux Cerfs, not just for lust, but for emotional escape. These girls were carefully trained to laugh at his jokes and distract him from the crushing weight of ruling a collapsing monarchy. Think of it as a royal version of Dionysian therapy, minus the goat masks and plus powdered wigs. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were exploitative grooming or voluntary ambition. But either way, they illustrate a timeless truth. Power, pleasure, and vulnerability are always linked. Just like in Dionysus's world. Now for your fringe fact. In some fringe Greek sects, Dionysus was worshipped not just as a liberator, but as a literal doorway. He represented the liminal space between the living and the dead. Some initiates believed that if you chanted his hymns in the right order, barefoot and tripping on wine fumes, you could slip through the veil. Not just mentally, but spiritually. Go too far into the grove, and you might not come back fully human. You might come back knowing too much. Or not at all. So that's where you are now, tipsy, barefoot, surrounded by strangers humming in harmony, and holding a cup of wine you're pretty sure wasn't made from just grapes. The god is coming, the beat is rising, and you're only one sip away from understanding why the ancient world both feared and adored him. You stand at the edge of the vineyard, cup in hand, and begin to realize that wine in ancient Greece wasn't just about getting buzzed. It was rebellion in a goblet, a controlled collapse, a permission slip to disobey. When Dionysus first ascended from Olympus with his purple-stained fingers and wreath of ivy, he didn't just bring alcohol. He brought revolution. Imagine the moment the first mortals tasted fermented grape juice. Not sweet grape juice from a Sunday picnic, but wine so sharp it burned your throat and rewired your thoughts. 1 minute you're tending goats and nodding politely at your tyrant king. The next you've taken off your sandals and you're screaming poetry at the moon. Because that's what Dionysus sold, not just wine, but transformation. The Greeks didn't even drink wine straight. It was always watered down, because full-strength wine, that stuff was dangerous. Sacred, a different animal entirely. Uncut wine meant you were aiming to forget your name, forget your role, maybe. Even forget the border between man and beast. Historians still argue whether these intoxicated rituals were state-sanctioned, subversions, or clever tools of social control. Let the peasants party now so they don't riot later. Either way, Dionysus had them dancing, and dance they did. Across the ancient world, wherever grapevines could cling to soil, his cult took root. He swept across Asia Minor, Egypt, even India in some myths, riding a chariot pulled by panthers and trailed by a posse of ecstatic followers. They called him Liberator, Loosener, the god who unbinds. Because where other gods demanded sacrifice in silence, Dionysus wanted noise. He wanted sweat. He wanted you to break character. You, the father, the priest, the soldier, the merchant, wanted you weeping into your wine because your wife doesn't see you anymore. He wanted the wife too, finally dancing because no one's watching. And while it all sounds deliciously hedonistic, Dionysus didn't just represent indulgence. He was also the god of boundaries, of pushing them, playing with them, then forcing you to confront the ones inside yourself. That's why tyrants hated him. That's why temples burned his effigies. Because a drunk populace isn't just a liability, it's a revolution waiting to happen. But back to your cup, you sip. The taste is earthy, almost violent. Suddenly, the world feels less solid. A drumbeat in your chest. A breeze that wasn't there a moment ago. Welcome to the experience of divine possession. In Dionysian rituals, wine wasn't about pleasure, it was about ego death. You drank not to escape reality, but to see it cracked open. The Greeks called it enthusiasm, being filled with the god, not metaphorically. They believed Dionysus could literally enter your body through your mouth, hitch a ride on the alcohol, and puppeteer you into catharsis. You wouldn't remember much the next day, but that was the point. Your rational mind had to shut up so your primal self could finally speak. Of course, there were rules. You couldn't just get drunk and call it a ritual. There were hierarchies, processions, chants. You needed the right songs, the right time of year, and the right emotional wound to crack open. Even chaos had choreography. And through it all, Dionysus stood half in shadow, half smiling, as if to say, go ahead, unleash. But don't pretend it won't cost you. Take, for example, our next sexy story, this time from the erotic spirit through history. In medieval Japan, a noble woman named Izumi Shikibu wrote poems so erotically charged that her affairs caused literal political fallout. She was once exiled from court, not for who she slept with, but for the way she wrote about it. In her verses, desire was a storm, sex was spiritual, and longing was more dangerous than war. One poem went, "Even if I now saw you, I could not say how much I miss you. The fire I stepped in yesterday still burns my sleeves." She, like Dionysus, knew that intoxication wasn't always about drink. Sometimes it was words. Sometimes it was wanting. Historians still argue whether her exile was punishment or performance art. But either way, her life was a testament to how personal expression can threaten the powerful. Just like a good cup of wine. Fringe fact: in certain rural Greek villages, well into the Christian era, farmers would still perform secret Dionysian rites in their vineyards each spring. They'd stomp grapes barefoot under the full moon, chanting half-forgotten hymns to a god they weren't supposed to believe in anymore. They called it tradition. They called it luck. But deep down, they knew they were calling something older. Something wild. And so here you are, in the swirl of it. Your throat is warm, your limbs loose, and the people around you are less strangers and more echoes of yourself. There's something ancient in your laugh, something sacred in your stumble. That's Dionysus, grinning with wine-stained teeth. From somewhere just beyond the firelight. You don't know whether to dance or cry. Which means you're doing it right. You blink, and now you're no longer in a vineyard, you're deep in the forest. The earth cool and damp beneath your feet, leaves whispering above your head like gossiping spirits. You hear the laughter first. Not polite giggles, but unhinged, belly-deep howls that rise and fall like a heartbeat. Then you see them, the maenads. Women who've left their husbands, their weaving, their sense of social decorum, and now roam. Wild in Dionysus's name, covered in ivy and animal skins, hair unbrushed, eyes bright with something holy or dangerous. They are the original girl gang, and no, they don't care what you think. To worship Dionysus was to reject structure, and these women were the blueprint. The maenads didn't just dance, they dissolved. They became part of something bigger than themselves, possessed by the god, speaking in tongues, sometimes frothing at the mouth like prophets in silk robes. Historians still argue whether they were feminist icons, cautionary tales, or just misunderstood performance artists. What we do know, they weren't here for the male gaze. In fact, they barely registered men at all, unless they were tearing one limb from limb for intruding on their rights. The most famous example? Pentheus, king of Thebes, who tried to shut down the cult. He sneaked into their forest rituals dressed as a woman, hoping to spy on the madness. What he got was an intimate dismemberment, his body shredded by maenads in a frenzy, including his own mother, who mistook him for a lion. When she came down from her divine possession and realized what she'd done, she didn't weep like a broken woman in a soap opera. No, she collapsed slowly, like someone realizing the floor beneath her was never real to begin with. That's the thing about the Maenads. They weren't evil. They were vessels. What they did under the gods' influence wasn't violence as we understand it. It was ritual, catharsis, an ancient purging. You don't have to like it. Just don't. Look away. But not all Maenads were violent. Some just danced. Some moaned their sorrows into the moss, hugging each other as if touch could stitch them back together. They didn't wear makeup or heels. Their adornments were natural snake bracelets, wildflowers, soot. Their breasts were often bare, not for erotic display, but as a declaration. This is my body, unowned and unashamed. They might slap you for staring, but they'd cradle a stranger if they cried hard enough. They were chaos and compassion braided into one being. Now let's slide in tonight's sex story, this one from Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality. Let's talk about the Roman poet Ovid, who wrote guidebooks on seduction disguised as literature. In one particularly spicy passage, he advises men to feign emotional depth to win women. Weep if she weeps, but do not be moved. She wants an actor, not a partner. That's not a pickup line. That's a survival manual for navigating performance, power, and consent in a patriarchal empire. Foucault argues that in Rome, sex wasn't about pleasure, it was about domination and image management. You didn't love someone because they moved your soul. You loved them because it looked good on paper. In that context, the Maenads raging, crying, real, were a terrifying inversion. They didn't perform. They just were, which made them radioactive. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some lesser-known cults of Dionysus believed the Maenads could literally see the future during their trances. While their limbs flailed and their voices cracked, they'd babble prophecies, some nonsensical, others eerily accurate. One fragment of ancient papyrus describes a Maenad in Delphi who predicted a locust swarm 6 months before it hit. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe the god used their pain as antennae, emotional sensitivity weaponized. It makes you wonder, what do we miss when we're sober, polite, and too afraid to scream? And now back to you. You follow the Maenads deeper into the woods, each step soft and damp, your breath misting in the cool night air. One of them hands you a thyrsus, a tall stick topped with a pinnacone wrapped in ivy. It looks like a wizard's accessory from a discount Halloween aisle, but you take it because something in her eyes tells you it matters. It's not a weapon. It's a symbol of authority, of sacred madness. You wave it once and the forest seems to sway. You don't know the dance steps, but your body starts to move. Not gracefully, not even rhythmically, but truthfully, because out here, nobody's judging. Out here, you are allowed to be ugly and transcendent at the same time. That's the gift of Dionysus, not beauty, not clarity, but release. You open your eyes and suddenly you're indoors, but not just any indoors. You're reclining on a velvet couch in a room so drenched in perfume, sweat, and candle smoke that the walls themselves seem to exhale. The air is thick with sandalwood and citrus, and someone's just handed you a cup of diluted wine laced with honey and herbs, meant to make you smarter, or at least sound like it. Welcome to the symposium. Not a modern academic conference with dry PowerPoints and awkward small talk over stale coffee, but the original Greek version. A drinking party where men gathered to argue, flirt, mourn, perform poetry, and maybe wrestle each other shirtless over the meaning of virtue. This wasn't drunken chaos, it was structured intoxication. The Greeks believed that a little wine opened the mind, a little more made you eloquent, and just enough could reveal your soul. But too much? You end up naked, crying about your ex, with someone drawing a mustache on your face in charcoal. They had bowls to measure how much wine to mix per person. They had a master of ceremonies called the symposiarch, who decided when to joke, when to get serious, and when to cue the flute girl. You sit among men in flowing chitons, sandals kicked off, lounging like lazy gods. Someone quotes Sappho, and then another counters with a bawdy joke about figs. Philosophers mingle with generals, and everyone's just a little too invested in the shape of each other's calves. And then there's you awkwardly clutching your cup, trying to look wise while wondering if your tunic is riding up. The thing is, symposiums were performance art. They weren't just about drinking. They were about creating a curated space where emotions, ideas, and desires could swirl like wine in a crater. If you had something to say, whether it was a profound theory on justice or a suggestive anecdote involving a donkey and a flute, this was your moment. And yes, sex was very much in the air. It wasn't orgiastic, not yet. This was the foreplay of the mind. Plato famously wrote that the highest form of love was between an older man and a promising young male student, bonded not just by lust, but by the shared pursuit of truth. Sounds noble, right? Until you realize these relationships often came with power dynamics so tilted they'd make a modern HR department weep. Historians still argue whether these pairings were exploitative or genuinely affectionate, but regardless, they were normalized, ritualized, even romanticized as essential to moral and intellectual development, which, depending on your mood, is either deeply poetic or deeply unsettling. Now, your sex story for the night. Back to Sex with Kings, where we find Peter the Great of Russia, a man who enjoyed throwing banquets so rowdy that guests occasionally woke up in different buildings. One of his favorite tricks? Staging mock weddings between dwarfs, animals, and drunk courtiers, just to see what would happen. At one party, he reportedly hired prostitutes to impersonate nuns and bless the guests before performing strip sermons. Peter wasn't just indulging. In vulgarity, he was using absurdity to destabilize power, mock hypocrisy, and maybe even cope with his own brutal reign. It was Dionysian in the purest sense. Pleasure mixed with panic, laughter edged with despair. Fringe tidbit time. In some symposiums, guests played a game called kotabos, where you flicked the last drops of wine from your cup at a target while making a wish about love. Miss the mark? Bad omen. Hit it dead center? Your crush was probably watching. It was drinking, flirting, and prophetic magic rolled into one elegant wrist motion. They say Socrates never missed, which tells you everything you need to know about him. Nerdy, annoying, but undeniably hot in a please debate me for 6 hours kind of way. You glance around the room. One man is crying softly about the death of his dog. Another is passionately describing a dream he had where Athena turned into a dolphin and gave him life advice. The flute girl plays something mournful. The symposiarch raises his hand, and suddenly everyone must take turns describing the nature of love. Some say it's a divine madness. Others say it's a trick of the flesh. One man insists it's a form of war. Another says it's the only thing that can humble the gods. You don't know what to say yet, but your chest is warm and your eyes sting slightly. And when it's your turn, you speak without thinking. Maybe love is what's left after the wine wears off and the silence creeps in. Maybe love is what survives embarrassment. The room goes quiet for a moment, then someone burps. The spell breaks. You lean back into the cushions, one hand gripping your empty cup. And for a brief, shimmering second, you feel it, that odd, gentle ache that Dionysus himself cultivates in his rituals. Not quite joy, not quite sadness. A little wound shaped like your own name. The party continues. Someone started singing a hymn. Someone else is asleep in a bowl of olives. The candles burn lower, and you are no longer just a guest. You are part of the rite. You wake with a fig stuck to your cheek and a stranger's sandal under your head. There's candle wax in your hair and laughter echoing through your skull. But you're not at a frat party. You're at the after party of the gods. Because now the symposium is done, the philosophy's been aired. The poetry wept over, and what comes next has no name you'd say out loud in daylight. This is the moment Dionysus whispers to his inner circle. The doors close behind you. And suddenly, you're at a ritual orgy where the robes drop. The rules shift, and everything is both sacred and slightly ridiculous. And here's the twist. There's etiquette. Yes, ancient Dionysian orgies had manners. You didn't just show up, toss your tunic, and dive in. There were expectations. Olive oil was involved, breath mints made of herbs and resin, and an unspoken agreement that politics were off limits. No one wanted to talk about tax policy mid-orgy. What you're witnessing isn't chaotic debauchery. It's structured transcendence through physical connection, a merging of bodies to dissolve the lonely boundaries of self. These weren't sex parties for fun. They were sex parties for God. And God was watching. The room you're in now glows red from the hearth, floor cushions arranged in a deliberate sprawl. A low table holds wine, fruit, and honey cakes dusted with something that smells suspiciously psychoactive. There's music, but it's not lively. It's low and droning, like a heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Someone begins to hum. Another picks up a tambourine and shakes it slowly. You're not sure who touches you first. Maybe it's a hand on your wrist or a shoulder brushing yours. Or maybe it's just the wine humming through your veins making everything feel warmer. The people here aren't conventionally beautiful. They're real. Their skin has stories. Their laughter has cracks. They look like people who've cried through funerals and laughed at inappropriate moments and now find solace in this sacred mess. And it is sacred. Don't forget that. Every movement, every glance, every accidental bump of knees carries a symbolic weight. Dionysian orgies weren't purely about lust, they were about ego death. The idea was that by shedding clothes and inhibition, you also shed status. No one here is king or slave. No one is philosopher or fool. You are bodies in motion, hearts syncopated with the rhythm of drums and breath. Sex isn't just pleasure, it's prayer. A slow-burning chant of flesh. Historians still argue whether these rites were public, private, or some mix of the two. Were they held in temples, forests, basements of noble villas? The truth is slippery, blurred by time and censorship. But fragments survive: pottery, poems, faintly horrified Roman commentaries. They all agree on one thing: it was real, and it was not tame. And now your sex story. This one from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History. In 19th century France, a secret society of libertines, known as the Rose Croix d'Orient, held erotic rituals in candlelit chambers. Beneath Paris, their belief that orgasm opened a channel to the divine. During their rites, participants would wear masks representing mythological archetypes: Venus, Pan, even Dionysus himself, and enact symbolic unions to balance cosmic forces. One witness wrote that the room smelled like incense, sweat, and the fear of revelation. Participants weren't allowed to speak during the ritual, only to breathe, moan, and whisper the names of gods. It wasn't orgy as scandal, it was orgy as opera. And that philosophy was ancient. Tonight's fringe fact: in one fragmentary Greek inscription found in the ruins of a Dionysian shrine, there's mention of an order of silence enforced. During group rites, no speaking, only sound. Scholars suggest this was to prevent the ego from reasserting itself. Language, after all, belongs to logic. But moans, breath, gasps, those belong to the god. Imagine that. A room full of people, moving, touching, trembling in synchrony, all without a single word exchanged. And yet, more deeply understood than ever before. Now back to you. You're still here, in the glow. You've lost track of time. The lines between you and others have blurred into something soft, animal, and kind. It's not orgy as porn, it's orgy as lullaby. A cradle of limbs and sighs where no one feels alone. Even when the touch ends, even when you find yourself curled in a corner, wrapped in someone's forgotten cloak, You carry the weight of it in your chest, the unbearable sweetness of being seen, touched, and held without judgment. And when the god arrives, because he always does, you don't see him. You feel him, a ripple across the skin, a warmth in your spine, a laugh that bubbles up from somewhere ancient and inexplicable. Someone begins to cry, not because they're sad, because they remembered something, because something opened, because Dionysus, that chaos-wrapped therapist of a god, has pulled one more splinter from a heart too long silenced. You're still buzzing from the afterglow, emotional, physical, spiritual, when the air shifts again. Not colder, exactly, but sharper, like someone just flung open the doors and let Olympus stumble in, drunk and overconfident. Because now you've been invited to a party where the gods are the guests, and let's just say, none of them know their limits. You'd think immortals would handle their liquor better, but no. Dionysus may be the god of wine, but when he throws a party, even the divine can't keep it together. Apollo gets poetic and increasingly unbearable, reciting self-written odes while aggressively tuning a lyre no one asked him to play. Hera starts with a single sip, then launches into stories about how no one appreciates her, especially her philandering husband Zeus, who's already on his third cup and eyeballing a cloud that looks vaguely like a nymph. Ares, bless him, just wants to arm wrestle everyone. Even Artemis, who usually skips these things, shows up with a smug, I don't drink energy that evaporates after half a goblet of sweet wine and a flute solo that hits just right. And yet, somehow Dionysus holds the room. He's the only one who knows how to balance madness with grace. He laughs with Apollo, calms Hera with a gesture, even manages to keep Aphrodite from hexing someone mid-toast. But he's not sober. Oh no, he's shimmering, his eyes glossed, with that dreamy detachment you only get when you're exactly the right amount of drunk and divine. He's got that sway in his step like he's dancing, even when standing still. And you're seated at the edge, trying to figure out why your wine tastes like regret, and whether you should move farther from Poseidon, who started splashing water at guests and flexing his trident. Here's the thing. Dionysian parties weren't about self-control, they were about controlled unraveling. Everyone was allowed to break down. The difference between mortals and gods? Mortals had shame the next day. The gods just blamed the wine, but those breakdowns? They were revealing. Take Hephaestus, god of fire and forgery. At one infamous feast, he stumbled in dragging a golden chair he had designed as a gift for Hera. She sat in it proud and was instantly trapped, legs locked, arms frozen. The god screamed, cackled, panicked. Only Dionysus could get Hephaestus to release her. How? He got him drunk, made him laugh, reminded him that even grudges should have a punchline. That's Dionysus in a nutshell. Divine therapy through intoxication. And now, your historical sex detour. Let's visit Empress Catherine the Great, not the absurd myth about horses, but the real woman who transformed Russian court life into a theater of seduction and diplomacy. From Sex with Kings, we learn she surrounded herself with lovers not just for pleasure, but for power calibration. Each affair was vetted loyalty, discretion, political potential. It wasn't just love, it was governance. She even assigned retirement packages to former lovers, including estates and titles. What Dionysus would have admired. The emotional choreography. The understanding that intimacy, politics, and performance were inseparable. And perhaps more importantly, that a well-placed kiss could do more than a treaty. Historians still argue whether she ruled with her heart, her body, or her brain, but most agree she ruled with all three in perfect synchrony. Fringe tidbit for the night. In some obscure Dionysian cults, they believed gods could get hangovers. Not metaphorical ones, actual, divine hangovers that caused earthquakes, storms, or sudden plagues of frogs. So after especially wild feasts, temples would hold soothing rites the next morning. Slow music, whispered prayers, offerings of cool water and lavender oil. Imagine that. A priest massaging a marble statue's feet, murmuring, "There, there, mighty Dionysus, we all overdid it." Divine self-care. And speaking of overdoing it, look back at the table. Apollo is passed out in a pile of laurels, mumbling something about justice. Hermes is gone, probably pickpocketed half the guests. Hera's locked herself in a guest room, muttering curses. Only Dionysus remains in the center, calm amid the wreckage. He raises his cup to you not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. Like, he's saying, yes, it's a mess, yes, they're gods. But it's still beautiful, isn't it? And you nod because it is. Because even in their ridiculousness, the gods reveal the truth. No one, no matter how powerful, is immune to longing, loneliness, or wine that hits too hard. The candles flicker low. You sip the last of your cup. Someone hums a lullaby. And you realize that the divine, at its most honest, looks a lot like us tipsy. Complicated, desperate to be loved, and occasionally found crying in a bathtub at 3 a.m., Dionysus doesn't fix it. He doesn't judge it. He just says, drink, dance, feel, and maybe tomorrow you'll understand why. You wake up tangled in linen, not sure if the fabric belongs to a bed, a toga, or someone else's overcoat. The air tastes like old wine and wild honey, and there's a low ache behind your eyes that isn't quite pain. It's more like you've been emotionally exorcised. And now, as your body recalibrates from divine revelry, your mind starts to piece together a truth that's always been there beneath the dancing. The sex, the wine, power and pleasure have always been lovers. In every empire, behind every throne, under every crown, there is always a bed. Tonight, you don't just attend the orgy, you peek behind the curtains of royal chambers, where strategy is whispered in moans and treaties are sealed with lips, not ink. Because in the world of Dionysus, nothing reveals character quite like desire. And no one wields that better than the ones born to rule. Imagine Cleopatra, not the sanitized Hollywood icon, but the real woman who spoke 9 languages and knew exactly how to tilt her head to make a room full of senators forget their policies. She didn't just seduce Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she turned their lust into leverage. According to Sex with Kings, Cleopatra used intimacy like a tool belt, not a weakness. She turned her boudoir into a diplomatic office. She once had a golden bed with gears inside that adjusted her position mid-conversation. Not to seduce, necessarily, but to control the gaze. The room, the angle, the story hers. Historians still argue whether her power came from sex or intelligence, as if the two were ever separate in the first place. Back in the myth world, Dionysus knew this fusion intimately. He wasn't a brute like Ares or a tactician like Athena. He worked in whispers, in glances, in trembling hands over shared goblets. His cult understood that surrender wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was currency. Sometimes it was camouflage. And sometimes it was theater. A queen might cry on cue to get what she needs. A courtesan might fake sleep to hear what she's not meant to. A king might offer his body to disguise the fact that he's already surrendered his soul. Sex, in this space, is not dirty or divine, it's both. It's sacred espionage. Now picture Versailles. The hallways glitter, the candles never stop burning. Louis XIV, the Sun King, turns court into cabaret. His bedchamber is a political arena, with courtiers competing not just for access to his time, but to his sheets. The king's morning ritual, called the lever, was an actual scheduled event. Nobles would gather and watch as he got dressed, hoping to be handed a shoe or a shirt. But behind the spectacle, real alliances were forged under silk sheets. Mistresses rose and fell like stocks. One glance could ruin a rival. One affair could shift the balance of Europe. And while the king smiled in portraits, he rarely slept alone. Your fringe fact? In some versions of Dionysian ritual, the high Priestess would sleep with a chosen initiate during the spring rites, not for romance, but as a symbolic union between god and follower. The act wasn't private, it was sacred theater, observed by the cult. Not voyeurism, but participation. The idea was that in witnessing divine union, the entire community was spiritually renewed, a public consummation of myth and man. You'd think that would feel clinical, but the descriptions left behind are anything but. Participants reported feeling waves of heat, euphoria, even prophetic visions. Sex wasn't climax, it was portal. And here's your quote-unquote sexy story of the night, pulled from Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra. While most people remember the book for its acrobatic illustrations, the real text is a surprisingly detailed manual on emotional intelligence and social navigation. One section describes how a king should choose a lover not only based on physical compatibility, but on their ability to mirror moods, manage jealousy, and engage in mutual distraction from worldly concerns. In other words, the Kama Sutra was less about bending backward and more about bending politics into intimacy. A lover wasn't just a partner, they were a pressure valve, an advisor in disguise, a soft place to land after brutal decisions. Dionysus would approve. So where are you now in this cascade of bodies and titles and whispered secrets? You're in a hallway outside a royal chamber, listening. You hear laughter that isn't joyful. You smell perfume mixed with something metallic like fear or ambition. You feel the walls pulse as if the very stone is tired of holding so many secrets. And in the distance, you hear that same old drumbeat. Faint, familiar, Dionysus is coming. Not with wine this time, but with revelation. Because the real intoxication was never the drink. It was power, shared, stolen, played for keeps. You step outside the chamber, hoping for silence, but instead stumble into a theater, except this stage isn't empty. It's loud, obscene, and very much alive. There are masks, yes, but not the delicate kind. These are grotesque, exaggerated, with noses like eggplants and mouths stretched wide in eternal moans. You're at a Dionysian play, and the curtain is never coming down. Welcome to the city Dionysia. Ancient Athens' version of Coachella meets Broadway meets a mildly possessed group therapy session. For several days every spring, the entire city shut down to stage performances in Dionysus's honor. And these weren't your standard myths gently retold with tasteful dialogue. No, these plays were vulgar, violent, and completely unfiltered, like if Shakespeare got blackout drunk with Freud and wrote a script while sobbing into a fig tart. You take a seat on the warm stone benches of the amphitheater. Around you, thousands of Athenian citizens, foreigners, slaves, squint into the sunlight and pass around dried fruit and wine. Then it begins. The chorus enters, stomping in perfect rhythm, their costumes adorned with massive flopping phalluses made of painted leather. Someone near you chuckles. Someone else is already crying. Because Dionysian theater didn't aim to entertain, it aimed to purge. This was catharsis in its rawest form. You laughed so you wouldn't scream. You wept so you wouldn't rot. The tragedies bled into comedies. Characters broke the fourth wall, mocked the gods, and sang about diarrhea between monologues on death. It was high and low art mashed together, and somehow it worked. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, these weren't dusty old names in a textbook. They were cultural disruptors, writing scripts that unpacked incest, war trauma, divine abuse, and the quiet horror of growing old. Dionysus didn't want clean stories. He wanted the mess, the contradictions, the wild swing between ecstasy and collapse. In one moment, Oedipus curses the gods and stabs his own eyes. In the next, Aristophanes stages a scene where women barricade themselves in a tower and withhold sex until men end the war. One man near you bursts into laughter, wine spurting from his nose. Another clasps his chest like he's just realized something terrible about himself. That's the magic. The mask amplifies the truth. The theater allows you to look directly at the pain without flinching, because it's wrapped in a costume and spoken in verse. Here's tonight's historic sex story. In Restoration England, after theaters reopened following Puritan bans, the stage became a place where real-life courtesans like Nell Gwyn rose to fame. She started as an orange seller, tossing fruit to gentlemen in the crowd, then transitioned to acting, and eventually became the mistress of King Charles II. But what made her irresistible wasn't just her beauty, it was her wit. She cracked jokes, flirted shamelessly, and once told a heckling nobleman, "I may be a whore, but I'm the king's whore." The crowd went wild. Dionysus would have given her a standing ovation, because the stage, like the bed, was a place to flip power, to surprise the audience, to reclaim the narrative. Historians still argue whether Nell was exploited or empowered, but everyone agrees she had the last laugh. And your fringe fact? In some ancient performances, the chorus wasn't just singing and dancing. They were tripping, literally. Some scholars believe that certain ritual plays were accompanied by smoke, from burning herbs like datura or mandrake, creating altered states for both performers and audience. This wasn't theater as escapism, it was theater as psychic surgery. The goal wasn't applause, it was transformation. If you didn't walk out changed, what was the point? Back to your seat. The play shifts again. A woman screams at the gods. A man begs for forgiveness he'll never get. A child offers a prayer that's half joke, half spell. You don't know why your throat feels tight. Maybe it's the heat. Maybe it's the way the actor looked at the crowd, straight into your eyes, as if to say, "This is your life too, isn't it?" Dionysus isn't on stage, but he's everywhere. In the laugh that dies in your mouth. In the tear you wipe before anyone sees. In the silence between acts, when no one claps because they're afraid to break the spell. The sun dips lower. The play ends, you rise, legs stiff, heart full. Around. No one speaks at first. Then someone giggles nervously. Someone else quotes a line that hit too close. The crowd begins to shuffle out, blinking like they've woken from a dream they can't explain. And what did you learn? Maybe that comedy is a shield. Maybe that grief is contagious. Or maybe that truth wears a rubber phallus and screams. It's lines to the gods because whispering never got anyone's attention. The path narrows now, not in space, but in sound. The laughter fades, the wine buzz softens, and your steps slow, not out of fatigue, but reverence. You're heading to a place few are allowed, and fewer still return from unchanged. This is no ordinary ritual, no cheerful procession or body performance. This is the core of the mystery, the part they warned you not to talk about. Welcome to the Dionysian Mysteries. No, not a Scooby-Doo episode. This is the real deal. Blindfolds, secret chants, emotional purging, and the kind of group silence that makes your bones itch. These weren't tourist attractions. They were transformative rites passed down in whispers and protected by unspoken law. To speak of them directly was taboo. But that won't stop us from leaning close enough to feel their breath on the back of our neck. You arrive at night, naturally, always at night. The grove is dark, but not ominous, more like a velvet pouch around your senses. You're blindfolded, because sight is too easy. You follow the person ahead of you by sound, by breath, by the faint rustle of leaves. Then you're led into a cavern, maybe a temple, maybe both. No one speaks. Instead, there are sounds, slow drum beats, low chants, wind through pipes. You're handed an object you can't see, a pinnacone, a stone, a small vial, and told to hold it tight. It's symbolic, but you're not told what it symbolizes. That's the point. Mystery initiations weren't about learning facts. They were about having your insides rearranged without anesthesia. Once inside, the ritual begins. There are stages: fasting, silence, ecstatic dance, grief, and then, if you're lucky, revelation. Some initiates cry for hours. Others laugh like they've just seen the punchline of the universe. One man collapses in a pile of feathers. A woman whispers her childhood fears into a fire. And through it all, you feel Dionysus present, but not watching like a judge. More like a midwife, coaxing your soul through the birth canal of your own illusions. Historians still argue. What actually happened in these rites? Some say they involved symbolic death and rebirth. Others claim hallucinogens were used to dissolve the ego. Some insist participants saw visions of the afterlife so vivid, they no longer feared death. Whatever the method, the result was the same. You walked in as a person, and you left as something else. Maybe not better, but rawer. More awake. Let's pull in a sex story now, courtesy of the erotic spirit through history. In ancient India, within the tantric sects, spiritual transformation also came through ritualized intimacy. One rite involved a man and woman joining sexually in front of their peers, not for pleasure, but as a living metaphor for cosmic union. The act was slow, sacred, and watched with closed eyes. The goal wasn't climax, it was transcendence. The moment when individual identity dissolved into divine oneness. Tantric texts describe this as dying into the other, a phrase that would have resonated deeply with Dionysus's followers. Because for them too, the body was a doorway, not a prison. A site of revelation, not shame. And here's your fringe fact. At certain mystery temples, including Eleusis and possibly some Dionysian sites, initiates would drink a potion called kykeon, made of barley, mint, and allegedly a psychoactive fungus related to LSD. Think about that. An ancient mind-altering smoothie that opened consciousness while everyone around you hummed in harmony. You weren't just told spiritual truths. You were chemically launched into them. And in that state, the god would come not as a man with a beard and a grapevine crown, but as light, music, vibration. You didn't meet Dionysus. You became him. Back in your body now. The ritual's ending. Your blindfold is removed. The cave is lit with hundreds of small flames. Faces glow not with glee, but with that delicate tremor of people who've survived something unnameable. No one claps. No one speaks. Instead, you're given a final offering, a piece of bread, a sip of wine, and told, remember this, but tell no one. It's not a threat, it's a promise. Because the real transformation isn't shareable. It lives in the way your heartbeat stutters when you hear drums. The way tears come too quickly when someone mentions their mother. The way wine tastes different, now darker, rounder, more alive. As you step back into the world, the stars above seem impossibly close, like you could reach up and rearrange them. You're not healed, exactly. But something in you has cracked open, and now the wind gets in. Dionysus never offered comfort. He offered truth. And sometimes, truth looks like a blindfold, a pinnacone, and a fire that knows your name. The wind smells like last night's smoke, like dried sweat and ripe figs and something else, something older, something metallic and sour, like guilt left out in the sun. You've danced, you've drunk, you've wept into your own hands, and now, as the last of Dionysus's rites dissolves into silence, you're left with the hangover. Not the throbbing head, morning breath kind. This is existential. You look around and the forest is no longer vibrating with ecstasy. The masks lie discarded in the grass. The wine jugs are empty. Someone nearby is throwing up behind a tree, with the quiet dignity of a priest. And you're not quite sure what's real anymore. This is the part Dionysus never advertised, the come down. The part where the euphoria evaporates and you're left staring at yourself in the reflection of a wine-dark puddle, asking questions no one taught you how to answer. Because for all the glitter and drama, the dancing in flesh and howling joy, the cult of Dionysus always ends in this moment. A stillness so heavy it feels like shame. But isn't. It's just the weight of knowing. Knowing you crossed a threshold and can't uncross it. Knowing the mask fit better than your own face. knowing you screamed something in that forest you didn't even realize you were carrying. And now you have to live with it. That's the gift of the god. Not escape, revelation. The ancient Greeks knew this part well. They even had a term for it. Anagnorisis, the moment of tragic recognition, when the hero sees things as they are. When Oedipus realizes the truth. When the party guest realizes the laughter is thinning out, and the sky is lightening, and they've said too much. Dionysus brings clarity through chaos, and now you see it. The rituals weren't distractions from life. They were life intensified, distilled, condensed into something you could taste and touch and scream through. Now the world feels ... muted. Tonight's final sex story comes from a more modern stage Paris, 1920s. Anaïs Nin, writer, lover, psychoanalyst's muse. She used her diaries as both mirror and weapon, documenting her affairs not with shame, but with surgical precision. She believed that sex was language, a way to narrate the self when words failed. In one passage she writes, "I want to live 1,000 lives so that I can burn through them all and finally understand who I am." Dionysus would have nodded slowly at that, because what she wanted wasn't pleasure, it was presence. A way to feel something true in a world full of masks. Historians still argue whether her writing was self-therapy or self-exploitation. But either way, she understood the price of constant transformation. And here's your final fringe fact. In late Roman times, some Dionysian cults began to fade. Not because of moral panic, but because of exhaustion. People couldn't keep up with the emotional intensity. The gods, they said, were too loud, too demanding. The rituals left them raw, open, unguarded in a world that increasingly valued walls. So they shifted to quieter forms. Mystery cults became meditations, orgies became metaphors. But the yearning, that stayed. Always stays. So here you are, barefoot in the grass, staring at your reflection in a puddle, half drunk on memory, trying to understand what it all meant. Was it divine madness? A sacred release? Or just really old performance art with amazing lighting and better wine than you'll ever afford? The answer doesn't matter. What matters is how your chest tightens when the wind brushes your face. How you suddenly remember the smell of time from a ritual meal you didn't even like. How someone's laughter high, cracked, real still, echoes in your ears like a hymn. Dionysus never wanted obedience. He wanted attention. To life, to feeling, to the unbearable miracle of being a body with a heartbeat and a story you barely know how to tell. And now, you carry that forward. Not as a priest, not as a cultist, but as someone who's tasted the edges, who's danced on the line between sacred and obscene and lived to stumble back. Your hands still smell like wine and pine. Your voice is hoarse. Your heart is full of holes that feel strangely like windows. So sleep now. Let the noise of the feast fade into soft percussion. Let the vines uncoil from your hair. Let the fire in your belly cool, just a little. You've survived the god of madness and desire, and you're not empty, you're just ... quieter. And maybe, just maybe, that silence is holy too. And now, let your breathing slow. Let your limbs grow heavy and warm, like vines curling gently around a still branch. The drums are distant now, muffled by time and memory. The laughter has faded, the candles flickered out, and even the gods have laid down their masks. What's left is just you, held softly by the darkness, the hum of the fan, the weight of the story settling into your bones. You don't need to remember every detail, just let the rhythm of it rock you. Let the images float behind your eyes. Like dream smoke, the flicker of firelight on skin, the tremble of flute notes in the distance, the wet earth under your feet. The god is gone, but the echo lingers. Let it lull you. Let it hush the corners of your mind. You made it. End of script. Sweet dreams.